And we went because this elderly lady felt that she was not going to live much longer. In the conversation, when we arrived, the lady was very cheerful and upbeat. And my blind friend could sense that and said, "I see you're very upbeat today. What has changed?" And she said that she had a visitor. The visitor came in the night, and she was unable to sleep and was feeling depressed. And she told us that a young man with blonde hair came to see her in the night, that he hovered in the air at the foot of her bed, that he had wings, and that he told her that all would be well. That was pretty neat, huh? Jesus loved her enough to send an angel to encourage and strengthen her. Exciting, huh? There's angels ready to encourage and strengthen all of us in our time of need. That's it.
If you'd like to turn with me to Genesis 22, I'll be reading verses 16 through 18. Genesis 22, 16 through 18. And this is the angel of the Lord speaking. And said, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing, and have not withheld your son, your only son, blessings I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants, as the stars of the heavens, and as the sands which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Amen.
Good morning. How many of you have, turn back to that reference, how many of you have at some point in time in your life gone to school? Okay. There was one hand at first. Let me turn it around. How many of you have never, ever attended school? Okay. Now, the next question is, how many of you in your schooling have come to school one day and realized at that moment when you came into class that there was going to be a test that day? And you had no idea. What was the feeling like? Yeah, it's a kind of a terrifying feeling, isn't it? How many of you have, let's up it a little bit. How many of you have shown up maybe here at church and seen your name in the bulletin board, or in the bulletin? You are on the bulletin to do something that day. How many of you have had that experience and were shocked? Oh, yeah, that is right. Anybody? Okay, so you kind of know what I'm saying. I did not have that experience today, so don't worry. But one of the songs got me thinking, sweet hour of prayer. And if you remember the words of the song, it is through prayer that gives you strength to deal with these things that are upcoming, all of which are going to be a surprise to some degree, right? How many of you know exactly what's going to happen tomorrow? Anybody? Life is uncertain, isn't it? We always have to be ready. So this morning, if you want to turn back to Genesis 22, I want to look at a story. The story of Abraham and Isaac. And I want to kind of nosedive into this story and maybe explore and just take it a few verses at a time and really cover the first half of the chapter of Genesis 22. And I really want to dig into that and ponder some of those things there and see if we can't find some elements of that story that we can recognize, how we can apply it to our own lives, and maybe see a little bit of a bigger picture and how we fit into that. So what I would like to do is I'll read a few verses out of Genesis, and then I would like also to go to the book Patriarchs and Prophets. I was listening. I've got that book Patriarchs and Prophets on my phone as an audio book, and I was listening to it one day, and some of these ideas just really struck a chord. And it's a pretty intense story. So I'll read it in Genesis, then I'd like to read some out of Patriarchs and Prophets, and then just share some ideas. And I want to kind of do this a little bit less formally than we normally would do a presentation. If something strikes you, feel free to add. So let's look at Genesis 22. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here am I. And he said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall tell you. And in Patriarchs and Prophets, we pick that spot up. It says, The command was expressed in words that must have wrung with anguish the father's heart. Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him there as a burnt offering. Isaac was the light of his home, the solace of his old age, and above all else, the inheritor of the promised blessing. The loss of such son by accident or disease would have been heartrending to the fond father. It would have bowed down his whitened head with grief, but he was commanded to shed the blood of that son with his own hands. It seemed to him a fearful impossibility. Going outside of his tent, Abraham looked up into the calm brightness of the unclouded heavens and recalled the promise made nearly 50 years before, that his seed should be as innumerable as the stars. If this promise was to be fulfilled in Isaac, how could he be put to death? Abraham was tempted to believe that he might be under a delusion. In his doubt and anguish, he bowed down upon the earth and prayed as he had never prayed before, for some confirmation of the command if he must perform this terrible duty. He remembered the angels sent to reveal to him God's purpose in destroying Sodom, and who bore him the promise of this same son, Isaac. And he went to the place where he had several times met with these heavenly messengers, hoping to meet them again, and receive some further direction, but none came to his relief. Darkness seemed to shut him in, but the command of God was sounding in his ears. take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom you love. That command must be obeyed, and he dared not delay. Day was approaching, and he must be on his journey. So let's stop and think about this for a minute. Did God have a discussion with Abraham that led up to him asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? No. Matter of fact, God emphasized, didn't he? Take your son, your only son, by the way, whom you love dearly. That kind of made it even harder, didn't it? Did in that passage where God spoke, did God explain what he was accomplishing to Abraham? No explanation. Up till that point, was Abraham a faithful follower of God? It's kind of a trick question. He had his ups and downs, kind of like us, don't we? Abraham, yes, he left the homeland of his fathers where nothing but pretty much idolatry had permeated the culture. He did leave that, and that probably took a lot of courage to do. But he failed twice in saying that Sarah, was his sister, which was a half-truth, right? Is a half-truth okay? No. And the situation with Hagar was a pretty big lack of faith, wasn't it? But he had obeyed in leaving his homeland. He had proved himself as a fairly fearsome warrior to go recover Lot and his family from the invading armies. But did Abraham complain or argue or ask why in that story? You don't hear it. Do you think you would have? Yeah? Yeah, notice how it fleshes it out. He mistrusted himself. Could I be imagining this? It was on him, not on God. He distrusted himself. So was he willing to make that sacrifice? He was, wasn't he? At this point in his life, if you dig through the chronology of Genesis, Abraham was 120 years old. Now, how old was he when Isaac was born? 100 years? So how old would Isaac have been at this point? 20-year-old man, young man. So Abraham was willing to do what the situation required. Let's go back to the story in verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and rose and went to the place which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the young lad will go over and worship and come to you again." Let's back up in the story. In Patriarchs and Prophets says, returning to his tent, he went to the place where Isaac lay sleeping, the deep, untroubled sleep of youth and innocence. For a moment the father looked upon the dear face of his son, then turned tremblingly away. He went to the side of Sarah, who also was sleeping. Should he awaken her that she might once more embrace her child? Should he tell her of God's requirement? He longed to unburden his heart to her and to share with her this terrible responsibility. but he was restrained for fear that she might hinder him. Isaac was her pride and her joy. Her life was bound up in him, and the mother's love might refuse such a sacrifice. Abraham at last summoned his son, telling him of the command to offer sacrifice upon a distant mountain. Isaac had often gone with his father to worship at some one of these various altars that marked his wanderings, and this summons excited no surprise. The preparations for the journey were quickly completed. The wood was made ready, put on the donkey, and with 2 servants they set forth. Side by side, the father and the son journeyed in silence. The patriarch, pondering his heavy secret, had no heart for words. His thoughts were of the proud, fond mother, and the day when he should return to her alone. Well, he knew that the knife would pierce her heart when it took the life of her son. That day, the longest day that Abraham had ever experienced, dragged slowly to its close. And while his son and the young man were sleeping, he spent the night in prayer. Again, what was his key? His prayer. Still hoping that some heavenly messenger might come to say that the trial was enough, that the youth might return unharmed to his mother, but no relief came to his tortured soul. Another long day, another long night of humiliation and prayer, while ever the command that was to leave him childless was ringing in his ears. Satan was near to whisper doubts and unbelief, but Abraham resisted his suggestions. And as they were about to begin the journey on the 3rd day, the patriarch looked northward and saw the promised sign, a cloud of glory hovering over Mount Moriah, and he knew that the voice which had spoken to him was from heaven. Even now he did not murmur against God, but strengthened his soul by dwelling upon the evidences of the Lord's goodness and faithfulness. What's the key? Dwelling on what? God's goodness and his faithfulness. This son had been unexpectedly given, and had not he who bestowed this precious gift had a right to recall his own? Then faith repeated the promise, in Isaac shall be thy seed. The seed, numberless as the grains of the sand upon the seashore, Isaac was the child of a miracle. And could not the power that gave him life restore it? Looking beyond that which is seen, Abraham grasped the divine word, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. It's a pretty intense story, isn't it? Early morning hours before daylight. A donkey, 2 servants, a bunch of wood, an old man of 120 years, and his son. 3 days of walking for an old man. Think about it. 120 years old. And this is after the ages of man really had dropped quite low, hadn't it? This wasn't like 120 years. He was old by those considered the days of his days. And I think where it says in verse 5, he told the servants, the young man, stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go to the mountain and worship and come again to you. Did Abraham really believe that? That it would be him and Isaac returning? I don't think he did. But he couldn't tell them. It was all building. Pick the story up in verse 6. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac, his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father, Abraham, "My father," he said, "Here am I, my son." And he said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both together. Yet none but God could understand how great was the father's sacrifice in yielding up his son to death. Abraham desired that none but God should witness the parting scene. He bade his servants remain behind, saying that I and the lad will go yonder and worship and will come to you again. And the wood was laid upon Isaac, the one to be offered. The father took the knife and the fire, and together they ascended towards the mountain summit, the young man silently wondering whence, so far from folds and flocks, the offering was to come. And at last he spoke, "My father, behold the fire, the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" Oh, what a test was this! How enduring the words, "My father." How they pierced Abraham's heart. Yet, but not yet. He could not tell him now. "My son," he said, "God will provide himself a lamb." Was this journey hard for Isaac? Do you think it was hard for Isaac? 20 years old, 3 days journey. I mean, it was probably 50 to 60 miles that they traveled. And considering those days, they walked everywhere. It probably was not difficult at all for Isaac. He was in the prime of his life. Was it hard for Abraham? What was the hard part about it? It was the mental part, wasn't it? The anguish of his soul. That he was a very old man, white-haired, who had just traveled 50 to 60 miles, hiked up to the top of a mountain, and only he knew where they were going and why. And as I read this story, I think, man, that was a man of iron, wasn't he? Really was. And no wonder in the book of Hebrews, he's in God's Hall of Fame. This one act that Abraham did in strict obedience to God's request proved Satan wrong. Satan said, "You can't. Obeying God is impossible. His law is too much." But here you had not only a man, a fallen man doing it, but an old fallen man, weary and exhausted. And when Isaac said, "My father," I think that made it even easier. Made it harder, didn't it? Yeah. Yeah. All right. And we're going to get to that. Yeah, Isaac carried his own wood. Wow. We are at verse 9 in Genesis 22. When they came to the place which God had told them, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to take the life of his son. At the appointed place, they built the altar and laid the wood on it. And then, with trembling voice, Abraham unfolded to his son the divine message. It was with terror and amazement that Isaac learned his fate, but he offered no resistance. He could have escaped his doom had he chosen to do so. The grief-stricken old man exhausted with the struggle of those 3 terrible days, could have not opposed the will of the vigorous young youth, but Isaac had been trained from a child to ready trust and obedience. And as the purpose of God was opened before him, he yielded a willing submission. He was a sharer in Abraham's faith, and he felt that it was an honor in being called to give his life as an offering to God. He tenderly seeks to lighten the father's grief and encourage his nerveless hands to bind the cords that confine him to the altar. And now the last words of love are spoken, the last tears are shed, the last embrace is given, and the father lifts the knife to slay his son when suddenly his arm is stayed. I can't help but just imagine and just kind of visualize this, because I'm a visual person anyway. Don't like reading books without pictures. But this creates its own picture, doesn't it? Start walking slower and slower because you know the spot that you don't want to get to. Once there, not only does Abraham have the struggle of his heart's burden, but having walked that far, now he's got to start picking up stones and building an altar. And if you look at pictures of these altars that are still out there in the desert today, they're not these quaint little things that you see in the picture book. This wide, that tall, and like that. These altars, if you look at them, are about the size of a sofa. They're huge, and the rocks are big. And you've got a 120-year-old man and his young son putting this thing together. I mean, that was exhausting, wasn't it? Everything was against Abraham. And then the wood. I'm just, in my mind, I can envision Abraham taking one piece at a time. I mean, just delaying this thing as long as he can, but at some point it's done. Everything is in order. And then he's got to sit down and tell Isaac, how do you tell your only child? There's a grand purpose going on, and you're part of it. How tough would that be? Pick the story up in verse 11. But the angel of the Lord called to him from the heavens and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said to him, Here am I. And he said, Do not lay your hand upon the lad or do any harm to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in the thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of the place, The Lord Will Provide. As it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. How do you think Abraham felt? It must have been a ways behind him for him not to have seen, and no doubt God, I'm sure, kept that ram quiet and still for the hours that it took them to put that altar together. But the Lord did provide himself a lamb, didn't he? The lamb paid the ransom. And I wonder, after the sacrifice, how long did Abraham and Isaac embrace? You think, how did they see each other after that? I mean, it's intense, isn't it? Abraham could look at his son, who was alive, who wasn't going anywhere. What do you think it did for Isaac looking at his dad? Do you think there was any fear? No, this is my dad. And I think it was that day that really Isaac grew up. There's one last paragraph I'd like to read in Patriarchs and Prophets. The very last paragraph of this chapter said it had been difficult, even for the angels, to grasp the mystery of redemption, to comprehend that the commander of heaven, the Son of God, must die for guilty man. When the command was given to Abraham to offer up his son, the intense interest of all the heavenly beings were enlisted. And with intense earnestness, they watched each step in the fulfillment of this command. When to Isaac's question, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham had made the answer, "God will provide himself a lamb." And when the father's hand was stayed as he was about to take the life of his son, and the ram which God had provided was offered in the place of Isaac, then light was shed on the mystery of redemption. And even the angels understood more clearly the wonderful provision that God had made for man's salvation. Ooh. That's why God gave that story, not only to Abraham, but in the paragraph before, says it's given for us. So look at the story. All of heaven, all the creating intelligences sat with bated breath watching this story. All eyes were on Abraham, because he's the only one that knew, right? And step by step, he honored God in strict obedience, faithful to what he knew was God's call, with unwavering agony. He fulfilled that duty. But notice, up till that point, even the angels could not understand fully and grasp the picture of when God was trying to describe to them what it was going to cost Jesus for the salvation of man. They just didn't get it. But they're watching this thing play out down on earth, watching this old man, and then in a flash, all eyes go to where? The Lamb. And they got it. And then instantly, everything snaps into focus. It was the Father, and it was Christ. He was the Ram. He was the Lamb. And you think about this, coming back, the next time that would happen, how many 1,000 years later? Near that very spot at the foot of the mountain. It would happen for real. The Son would be slain. And now all of heaven saw what God the Father had been going through in the development of the plan of redemption. So then, this is where you and I come into the picture. That lamb took our place, didn't it? It was us. And we look, we can relate to Abraham at God's request of him, but can we relate to God the Father that did make the sacrifice? The Father was willing to let his Son go, Christ, the Son, was willing to go. And so I ask, what about you? What about me? Are we a willing sacrifice? Romans 12:1, how does it go? I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you, what? Present yourself, your bodies, a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God. Have we been called to sacrifice, to make sacrifices? If we look at what he's done for us, can we do any less if we choose to love him? Is there anything not worth giving up for his offering us eternity? Would we trade heaven for a nice house? For safety? For food when there is none? For a favorite little thing that we don't want to give up? Put in that perspective, it kind of changes things, doesn't it? When you go home today, look around you and measure what you see by Christ's standard, by his sacrifice, and ask yourself, is it worth eternity? This afternoon, go back and read that story in Genesis 22, and then pick it up again if you've got the book Patriarchs and Prophets. It's the chapter entitled The Test of Faith. And I wonder, are we capable of being just as faithful today? We can. Although it's very few and far between, we see it so little. But the world needs us to demonstrate this iron-clad faith. If the world doesn't see it in us, where are they going to get the picture? You know, this is the close of time, isn't it? I mean, we kind of all believe that, just looking at what's going on around us. It's imperative that we show this picture of Abraham here in 2017. We all have choices we have got to make. And our faithfulness weighs on it, doesn't it? And if we come up to that time unprepared for the test, how's it going to go? It's not going to happen, is it? Something to think about. Sometimes we think about things that are easy and fun to read. Sometimes we have to deal with things that are a little more serious. But eternity weighs on those points, doesn't it? Something to think about. Let's bow our heads for prayer. Lord, most holy Father, Lord, each one of us stands in a position that is at risk. We just ask that you would send your Spirit to bring into focus what we need to see individually, that will bring us under strict and faithful obedience to you, to your laws, your governing desire for each one of us to be a witness, a light to the world around us, to show unswerving and faithful, not only obedience, but a faithful character that is completely representative of yours. We can't do this on our own. We need your Spirit to be working in and through us. So we just ask, Lord, that you would work on our hearts as we rest today and as we start a new week, that you would make this week count and just lead us into your kingdom, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he should give his only Son to make a wretched